My feather bed is deep and soft, and there I'll lay you down. I'll dress you all in yellow silk, and on your head a crown. For you shall be my lady love, and I shall be your lord. I'll always keep you warm and safe, and guard you with my sword. And how she smiled, and how she laughed, the maiden of the tree. She spun away and said to him, no feather bed for me. I'll wear a gown of golden leaves and bind my hair with grass. But you can be my forest love, and me your forest lass. Well, hello and welcome back. If you are here for the first time, welcome for the first time. I am your germ spreader, the Fattest Leech. You may call me Leech. Everybody calls me Leech. I mean, it's my God-given registered name and all. Today we are going to do the reread for my most favorite George R.R. Martin story ever, which is Meathouse Man. So this is going to be, I can tell you right now, this is going to be a longer video, hour at least. I'm thinking at least an hour and 15 minutes. However, per usual with my video reviews, my video reviews are more like synopsis plus compare contrast to all of Martinworld. And the point is to get everybody to read these stories, to read the notes, to start evaluating A Song of Ice and Fire using Martinworld themes and archetypes and tactics and everything else that comes along with it. So in order to keep this video at a reasonable length, I'm not going to read every single note that I have on my blog page, but you can follow along with this video if you'd like and read the additional notes for yourself. Or if you're finding this video because of YouTube, I have the link to the blog page right there in the notes section for the video. So what is Meathouse Man all about? Let's just start with that to see if you're even interested in this story. It's told through the point of view of the main character, Greg Trager. This story is about personal struggle and using various methods of power to overcome your own shortcomings. It's an emotional story, and it strongly applies, not to George R.R. Martin personally. This is pretty close to being an autobiography or a page out of his diary, as I've mentioned it over the years. It's an emotional story, and it strongly applies to the three top main characters that we have in A Song of Ice and Fire as well. So let's face it, that's why we're all still interested in doing Martinworld style analysis, is to something for us to do and explore as we wait patiently for the Winds of Winter. So our top three main characters that we see these elements from Greg Trager, and just the whole theme and atmosphere of Meathouse Man in general, that would be Bran, Jon, and Daenerys. And then there are the secondary or B-level, however you want to phrase it, characters and subplots that it also applies to, such as Euron and his silenced crew, as well as the undead like Lady Stoneheart and Melisandre of Asshai. Daenerys' three dragons are undead. She brought them back to, quote, life from dead stone, as she says. And what happens in this story, as well as Song of Ice and Fire, why we see people or these characters go through certain changes like that, is because they're navigating their way through love and rejection and denial and trying to find their place in the world. If you read Dream Songs or listen to a lot of George interviews or read a lot of George interviews like I tend to do, this story was written around a time in his own life where he was struggling personally with his love life. I don't want to speculate too much about that now. I'll give the guy some privacy. But not just his own love life, but his professional work life. And at one point, he even had to move back into his parents' house at Bayonne because things were getting a little tough. I think a lot of us have been there at some point or some level or another. Look at George. He's just like us. So I do want to add, in addition to people like Bran, John, Danny, Euron, the undead, like Melisandre, those types of characters, Patchface even, those types of characters, George likes to give us the wild card. The wild card character. And I will say that we will see sort of twisted shades of Petire Littlefinger Baelish, to pronounce it as Roy Dotrice does. Peter Baelish is in here, except the twist to him is he runs the brothels as a secret spy network, like what happens in Override, which is the other corpse handler story that I have transcribed and videoed, and I'll link to it in the notes to this video. So Littlefinger with his gray-green eyes, that corpse dead color in his eyes is signifying that he's symbolically dead or about to be. And additionally, the twist to that is, without getting sidetracked with too many Littlefinger theories, which is very easy to do, he's the one that runs the Dead Man's Depot with his brothels, and he's the dead man, so to speak, that is in love with the living. So that's a twist on what we're going to see here with Greg Trager. He's in love first with Catelyn, but now Catelyn is now Lady Stoneheart, so she's an undead. So Sansa has taken Catelyn or Lady Stoneheart's place. So yeah, that's something that you'll see little specks of throughout this story. So before we go on too much further with this story, I want to add in my own little spiel for a moment here. I've been talking about this story. I've been talking about Martinworld in general. I've read, those are all George's story. That shelf is just the books of just George books. I've read all of his work, 80 plus stories, watched all of his stories that are on television in one form or another. And I've been talking about this for years. And whenever a Meathouse Man comes up, the first thing people get hooked on, and the only thing they seem to be able to focus on in the story is the first encounter with the dead people that we see in the story. And that is what Greg Trager going to a brothel and having sex at the brothel. I've seen a lot of really bad takes on this, that he's using women as being, or even George is, has no respect for women, and he's just seeing them as, discarded pieces of meat. I can't quite agree with that. That might be something that in, these modern 2020 plus times that we're living in, maybe an author might not write that way or use people that way, but that's completely missing the point of the story. Plus, Greg Trager doesn't just have sex with people. There's a whole collection of corpse worlds where there are theaters, where there's gladiatorials, where there's people cutting back trees and mining. It's not just women, and they're not just used this way. So you have to remember, this story was written, I forget at the moment, 30, 40 years ago. And so while some authors nowadays might handle a few topics differently, we are still reading a 40-year-old story written by an older gentleman that is writing the saga we are all very involved with, and it's best to pay attention to his previous work if you want to understand A Song of Ice and Fire. This story is legitimately like a page from his diary. I have said it 10 times before, I'll say it again. So if you're going to giggle at any of the sincerity that is in this story, or think that this is just some icky, twisted story about sex with dead people, feel free to go read any other page on the blog or watch another one of my videos. I have 2 other corpse handler videos out there. And that's probably because this story isn't a good fit for you. All right, so now I got down off of my rusty hold up bucket. Let's get back to the story. So in keeping with the strong overarching Martinworld theme, Meathouse Man also uses the fire versus tree symbology that signals to the reader what path the main character is headed. When Germ says fire is about heat and passion, and etc., don't forget he dials it up to 1100 as he tends to do for A Song of Ice and Fire. He's not ever using a source of inspiration for him one-to-one. So he might say that, draw on that Robert Frost poem that fire is love and passion and stuff like that. But this story is a perfect example of how he uses things, themes, topics, tropes, all of that. He uses them his own way. So to understand George, you should study George. And in keeping with that idea, let's keep that part rolling. The way that George writes about his own lived experiences, how he was at the young age, he's internalizing these personal tragedies. And as we see with Greg Trager, he is outwardly displaying his emotions through the phases of his life that are represented by the surroundings, like the sex house, the overworked mining job, the theater, the fighting pits. This is very much how he writes the ship, the Eclipse, in Fever Dream, or the way Haviland Tuft's psionic cats react in Tough Voyaging, or the way the dire wolves are the extensions of the Starks, or the way Daenerys' dragons outwardly react to her mental feelings. So the dead people in here are a Martinworld theme of the outward extension of what's happening inside. Another way that George handles corpse handling in general, in his 3 corpse handling stories and in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is part of Martinworld, is the stranger. The stranger represents death and the unknown and leads the dead to the other world. Whilst referred to as a male, he is neither male nor female, just like dragons are. The stranger's face has been described as half human, concealed beneath a hooded mantle. The wooden statue of the stranger burnt on Dragonstone is carved to look more animal than human. Worshippers rarely seek favor from the stranger, but outcasts sometimes associate themselves with this aspect of God. This is extremely, especially that last line, that the outcasts associate themselves with this aspect of the God. Outcasts. That's exactly what we're going to see in Greg Trager. That we also see at some point or another in Jaime Lannister and Jon and Bran even, but most largely on that big top tier A level. These are all dragon elements. So we see this the most with Dany, who is the fire dragon of the story. That's in the part of the title of the story, Song of Ice and Fire, and the ice dragon others. And this is according to George from an interview, I think back in 2015. I've talked about it before, but he describes he's explaining what the title of the story means, A Song of Ice and Fire, that it's It's basically talking about the two biggest threats to humanity in Westeros, which is the ice element, the ice dragon others, and the fire element, Dany's invasion with her dragons. So you might be thinking, but Leech, if this is so much primarily like the Dany or the dragon element, and that sounds like such an antagonist thing or a character to have, there's no way an author or George would make an antagonist a main POV. He has. And you don't have to know all of Martinworld to understand this. You can go slowly, one story at a time. That's what I did. But once you get to a certain point, especially when you've been through all 80 plus stories of his, you start to see this pattern over and over and over again. It's really about the archetype and not the setting of the story, not the furniture of the story. It's really about the story itself, the characters, the whole heart and conflict idea. As far as having an antagonist in a George story as the main POV, absolutely, George has done that. And very coincidentally, they're all of the Daenerys prototype characters, such as Cyrene from The Glass Flower, which I have transcribed, Simon Crest from Sand Kings, which I have transcribed, John Bowen from This Tower of Ashes is a fiery element, and Richard Cantling from Portraits of His Children. That's another one. Just a couple of them to name a few. So this is something that's in George's bag of writing tricks. Speaking of George's writing tricks, we owe this beautiful story in its existence to Harlan Ellison. May he rest in space somewhere out there. May he finally have his mouth and he can scream. If you are not familiar with Harlan Ellison by name, you probably know him already by his multiple contributions to the sci-fi fantasy, and he would hate it if I labeled it as such. Basically, this weird speculative fiction genre as a whole. He's done a lot more than you might realize. I have a lot of links to Harlan Ellison on the page, but it's because of Harlan Ellison that we have this story. He's the one that pushed George into writing it, into rewriting it, into opening his veins and actually bleeding some truth and emotion into it. Again, say this all the time. This is George's best story ever. And if you're just giggling at the opening, you've totally missed the point. There are several quotes that I have on the page where George talks about Harlan and the writing process of this story. I'm not going to quote the whole thing. That's something you can read. But even though this story was published in one time frame, in 1976, it was actually written and rewritten a few times and edited for a couple of years before that. And I also want to take a quick moment to show you guys that you can get this story a couple different ways. It's on Audible because it's in this Dream Songs manual. They've become like working textbooks to me now, these books. In this book, in Dream Songs Volume 1, Meathouse Man is in here. It's under the section Hybrids and Horrors, which I highly recommend you reading. A few years ago, it was nominated, or Raya Golden, I should say, was nominated for a Hugo Award for the artwork that is in this graphic novel, which is absolutely beautiful. Beautiful work, beautiful colors. She's a very talented artist. George had Raya Golden back a few years later. She did Starport, which this is my signed copy of Starport that came out in, I think it was 2019. And I met her and George again. We talked about a few things, and she's an amazing person by her work. It was also just announced that Raya Golden is going to be doing a graphic novel version of the first Tough Voyaging story, The Plague Star, which is, cannot wait. But this story, Meathouse Man, first came out in Orbit 18. This is a first edition copy that I have here. And it was in a library. It's a library copy. That means this was put out to the public. Love it. Love it. Anyway, so the whole point is, if you're doing a first-time read or reread, there are several options, several ways to get this story, in addition to me having it transcribed on my blog. Okay, so in addition to having Harlan Ellison and Raya Golden bringing this story to life and having an impact on its existence, there are a few, actually quite a few in this story, outside personal real world references that George has built into this story that really drives home the point, the theme, the overall feeling of this story. If there's a George story that if you read it and you really take it in to what it means and what it's trying to say and trying to do, this is probably one of the closest stories to make you cry about your own lonely existence and place in the world than anything else. I think possibly, like A Song for Raya would be another one of those stories that does that. But let's get back to some of his real world references first before we go off on a tangent about A Song for Raya. Chris Christopherson, that is a singer that George has used in one way or another, whether it's his name, his personality, or his songs, and a couple of his stories, including Bitter Blooms and a character in Night Flyers. The first reference we see to Chris Christopherson in this story is the section titled Duvalier's Dream. It's about it's a song about a man who is a disillusioned dreamer who would never love again. Yes, if Bloodraven and Shiera Seastar came to mind, absolutely. I have all of the information, the text, the lyrics and the music video on my blog page if you want to find out more information on this song, because there's a whole section of Meathouse Man that is written to this theme. And the second Chris Christopherson reference is in the section called The Pilgrim, which is chapter 33. It's a lyrical autobiography written while Chris Christopherson was in jail. And it describes a man who has fallen on hard times. Using songs from the real world and poetry, we're going to get to it in a second, but there's a lot of poetry in this story as well, is something George has used several times throughout his Thousand Worlds universe, but also in Fever Dream and also in Armageddon Rag. And yeah, I say this often. It's like the idea of, kill the author does not exist in George's work. It's all about the author in George's work. So poetry. George is a known lover of poetry. The Iron Throne is Ozymandias, according to George R. R. Martin. Which is funny in a scary way, because that is what the Iron Throne represents, and that is what the Fever Dream ship in Fever Dream was taken over and renamed as the Dragon element came and stole the rule. There's an interview from a few years back where he's talking about the Iron Throne and what it represents. He says it's the king is looking down, with emphasis on the word down, looking down on everyone in the court. My throne is a hunched beast looming over the throne room, ugly and asymmetric. It's a throne made by blacksmiths, hammering together the half-melted, broken, twisted swords wrenched from the hands of dead men or yielded up by defeated foes. It is a symbol of conquest, suppression. And then he says, this iron throne is scary and not at all a comfortable seat, just as Aegon intended. Look on his works, ye mighty, and despair. Because he had just previously mentioned Ozymandias. And in this short little info section on the poetry that George uses, I give links to and/or lots of examples of where he uses poetry in other stories, and even his television show Beauty and the Beast. So in Meathouse Man, he has a section that's titled When I Was 1 in 20, and it's taken from a poem by the same name by A.E. Housman, which the young speaker talks about the experience of falling in and out of love. You see this repeating theme going on for this story. And again, I have all of that poem on the page if you're interested in reading that poem. There's another section that's titled Wanderings that is based on a poem by William Butler Yeats, whom George has referenced in stories, other stories of his, including 9 times in Armageddon Rag alone. So, and then he, even in this Meathouse Man story, he even references the Darkling Plain again, which comes from Dover Beach, something that he referenced very much in his story, A Song for Raya. So this story, Meathouse Man, is far, far beyond just creepy sex with dead people. I mean, seriously, get out. So what does George have to say about this story? A lot. This is one of the stories that you can actually find a lot of information on, where he speaks personally. And I will say that a few years ago at Balticon 50 in Baltimore, I was there at the dinner. I had the dessert course with George, and he sat right here, right next to me. We were bumping elbows as he was eating lemon cakes. And we started talking about I asked him about, I should say, I started asking him about some of his old works. And he was really, that perked his ears up. And he was, I think, a little bit shocked that somebody was asking him about that instead of just Song of Ice and Fire or even the TV show Game of Thrones. And he was more than willing to talk to me about any of his old work. And I told him that Meathouse Man was my favorite story of his, and he was like shocked again. And he told me in person, and I'll have this all linked, what an emotional story this is for him. This is an emotional story for him. This is how he describes it all the time, even to the point in Dream Songs where he says 30 years later, at the time of that writing, 30 years later, I still find it painful to reread. And he says, I was wounded and in a lot of pain, and I put it all into Meathouse Man. So this is a very rich, deep, dark story of George's, that he has taken these elements and plucked them apart and applied them to different Ice and Fire characters at different stages of their life. And that's not something to be ignored. So let's talk a little bit about the story itself. So what's in a name? There's the quote out there by George where he says that he doesn't really know a character until he figures out their name. So names are very important to him. The names of the characters we're going to meet in this story. There's Greg Trager. He's the main character and point of view, as I mentioned before. He represents the deepest fathoms of George's id. And he wanders on the Darkling Plain. There are a few aspects of Trager that put him on a level as even a Cold Hands prototype, if you want to get down to that B and C level character. Like the sadness and these wandering guards the sadness in these wandering people. There's Josie. She has short brown hair. She's covered in motor grease. She's Trager's first human love, and he meets her in Scracky. There's Donnelly, Trager's best friend from Vandalia, and both are handlers who cut down trees. There's Laurel, Trager's second girlfriend that he meets on Vandalia. She leaves Trager, and she is a Tree Girl Brienne prototype. Absolutely, without a doubt. So I've mentioned it a little bit already that there are elements of Jamie in this story. Well, there's elements of Brienne in this story as well. If you're a Jamie and Brienne shipper, just know that it might not end the way that you want it to. Even though I would love it to end that we all want it the way between them the way we all want it to, I don't think it's actually going to happen. So those are the main characters that we meet in this story. Now, the names and the locations, because setting is just as much of a character as the characters are. So, Scracky. This is the planet where the story begins and then ends on. This is the world where the handlers work in factories and mills or in strip mines like Vandalia. Valyria and Ashai by the Shadowlands, all of that, any of the corpse worlds that are in A Song of Ice and Fire, they come from these 3 corpse handler stories that are here in Martinworld in his Thousand Worlds universe. So something else that these Valyria, Ashai, Shadowland areas, corpse handling worlds have in common. The planet's air is always heavily polluted with sulfur. Sulfur is described in A Song of Ice and Fire as dragon stink, the smell of dragons. There's always like mining or over mining. The sun doesn't really shine very often. These are very just, it's like I say a lot, is the Ice Dragon Others, and Martinworld as a whole, the Ice Dragon Others and the Fire Dragon elements, they represent either a government and or corporate overreach. These are the 2 big controlling operations that are throughout all of Martinworld, and they're the ones that really crush or overwork or work to death the small folk. And that's how we get corpses. You have to produce everything in life until you die, and then you have to continue to produce, and whether that's war or product or what, you have to continue to produce even after death. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Yeah, coming from an old hippie guy, you better believe this is what he's doing. So yeah, Vandalia is repurposed into Valyria for A Song of Ice and Fire. The cities of the Valyrian freehold created are all parts of the corpse handler idea, and the freehold is an oxymoron because none of these cities were truly free from the bower burn theology of the dragon lords who kept them as slaves. The irony in calling people free when it's for worship is something we see developing in Daenerys' arc. Each of these freehold cities specializes in some product or talent, just like the different planets where they use dead people to do the work for them. The corporate dragon, the corporate dragon, that's who they're all working for. Working to death and beyond. You're left with cheap solace, as we will see in this story. So a note about Vandalia in the real world, from the real world, it's the Grand Ohio Company. Eventually, it does exist in the real world. Let me back up and say that again. It does exist in the real world. So a little information on that. It comes from a part of history where the Grand Ohio Company received a larger area of land than the Indiana Grant. The development of companies planned a new colony, initially called Pittsylvania, later known as Vandalia, in honor of the British Queen Charlotte Mecklenburg Strelitz, who was thought to be descended from Vendalic tribesmen. So we have Pennsylvania. Remember, Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh is another corpse handler story. I know Pittsburgh exists in real life, but all of these things are connected, and this is how George plucks a little bit from real world history, but writes it as something that is uniquely his own. Gideon is the main city on Vandalia. It's also from real world origins. This is the masculine name given and the surname of Hebrew origin, which translates into feller or hewer or great warrior. It can also be interpreted as the one who has a stump in place of a hand or one who cuts down. Both of these things. I say this all the time. To cut into a person in A Song of Ice and Fire is an act of fire, and I will link to that if you want. But to cut into a human is like cutting into a weirwood tree, like we see. Who is it? I'm gonna get this wrong. Like Prince Damon does at Harrenhal when he's waiting for somebody else to show up and he's cutting into the weirwood tree. Those are all acts of fire. That is what a fire element does to a tree element. We see this in Meathouse Man as well. So in Meathouse Man, this is the name of the city where the fighting pits and the gladiatorial cities are. You can easily see how George has repurposed this information for people like Corrin Halfhand, Arthur Dane, Jaime Lannister, and even Jon Snow, King of Winterfell. There's all of this naming and wordplay and cutting into the tree element. Jon is a tree element. He is not strictly an ice element in the story. All right, so another location, let's keep going on. Another location, Slag, another corpse planet we never visit or hear much about other than that it exists. And then from Override, we get a little bit more in the corpse handler worlds. We also have the planet Grotto, and then we have New Pittsburgh from the story Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh. These are all the working planets for the corpse handlers. So to the story itself. Meathouse Man by George R.R. Martin. There's a little there's a line, like I forget what it's called in literature. It's just left my brain, but it's like a indication line or setup line, a thematic line that opens the story. That's not part of the story, but it's very integral to the rest of what you're about to experience. For Meathouse Man, that line is, his hands were machines, his heart a nuclear furnace, and he stripped the planet bare looking for love. That's something any of you who follow me on the twit hole, huzzah. His hands were machines, his heart a nuclear furnace. That's something I talk about a lot. What does George say the dragons are? They are nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrents. And only for A Song of Ice and Fire did he actually put them into like animal dragon form, where in the rest of Martinworld, wherever he's needed that dragon element, it has shown up as some sort of dragony type machine or even some sort of winged banshee. But it's also shown up as cars. His dragons are air cars in other stories. So right from the beginning, as we see in Armageddon Drag, huzzah, I could probably huzzah that one too. He is stripping the planet bare, looking for love with his nuclear furnace. That's what Sandy Blair does, is he's taking his daydream, his bronze daydream, across the U.S., trying to chase his hippie love girl that turns out to be the villain, but that's a different story. I love that story. That's a different story. So the story proper starts. They came straight from the ore fields the first time. Trager with the others, the older boys, the almost men worked their corpses next to his. Cox was the oldest of the group, and he had been around the most, and he said that Trager had to come even if he didn't want to. Then one of the others laughed and said that Trager wouldn't even know what to do, but Cox, the kind of leader, shoved him until he was quiet. And when payday came, Trager trailed the rest to the meat house, scared but somehow eager, and he paid his money to a man downstairs and got a room key. And then it goes on and says, he stank of sweat and sulfur. There we go again. Like all who walked the streets of Scracky, but there was no help for that. It would be better off if he could bathe first. But the room did not have a bath, just a sink, double bed, and sheets that looked dirty, even in the dimness, a corpse. So from this opening, to start our comparison, we get Cox is basically the Garrus Drinkwater in the situation, and Trager is Quentin Martell. Cox pushes Cox, or the Garrus person, is pushing their friend into the snuggery, as it's referred to in Ice and Fire. And all this happens in the Dragon Tamer scene, the chapter of A Dance with Dragons. And when Quentin gets consumed by fire, that is essentially what is happening to Greg Trager right now. This is the beginning. He's a young boy at this point. He's very young, smooth cheeks. You see a lot of this in Raya Golden's graphic novel version of this. He's a lot like Quentin, and he is taken down into the corpse, sweat and sulfur pits below, and he is turned into a corpse. Sorry, but Quentin's dead. I did a line-by-line analysis of that if you want to read that. It's linked on the page. So other examples of A Song of Ice and Fire dead man sex. This is not all of them, just a few examples, especially from the handler. You have to think about the handler having sex with somebody. Daenerys having sex with the sex slave, that is eerie. Cersei having sex with Taena Merryweather. You know, her last name, Merryweather, is loaded with information. Ygritte with Jon Snow the first couple of times. Jon didn't want to have sex with Ygritte. He even likened Ghost to being a sword and put Ghost between them for a long time until Ygritte was like, no, kick your dog out. So then we get to some other parts where we see some of the mechanics of it. So what are animated corpses like Melisandre doing? They're animated by R'hllor. Her red ruby is what is keeping her alive and animated to do R'hllor, whatever R'hllor is. He's some sort of fifth element fire offshoot of the green. Robert Strong is animated by Cersei's green fire, so to speak, via Qyburn. And in the story Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh, there's a very distinct scene of a doctor doing something to somebody that's like Qyburn, Robert Stronging Robert Strong. Lady Stoneheart and Beric, Lord of Corpses, they're both animated by fire at this point in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the end of A Dance with Dragons. Euron Greyjoy is also a type of handler with his ship that has silenced men, as well as the Dusky Woman. What this is they operate through a synthebrain. The dead people have a synthebrain. We also see a little bit of this as the Night Flyer ship, the mothership. That's a dragon ship in space. It's called the Night Flyer, which has links to Euron and it's mostly Dany from A Song of Ice and Fire. She keeps her soul etched in a ruby crystal. It's not a whisper jewel. Whisper jewels are something totally different in Martinworld. This is more like a soul jar, as I talked about in the previous corpse handling story. So, from Meathouse Man, only the brain was gone, ripped from her, replaced with the dead man sent the brain. She was meat now, an extra body for a corpse handler to control, just like the crew he had worked each day under the sulfur skies. She was not a woman anymore, so it did not matter that Trager was just a boy, a jolly-faced, frog-faced boy who smelled of scracky. This is exactly what our undead are in A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as the undead in the rest of the story, the rest of the corpse handling stories. So Traeger's going on with this corpse, and he's exploring her. He's exploring every hole in her. This is his first time, and he's figuring things out along the way. And then he notices, and he says, and the corpse responded. She thrust up at him hard, meaty arms wrapped around his pimpled back to pull him to her. Traeger groaned and reached down between her legs. She was hot, wet, excited. He trembled. How did they do that? Could she really get excited without a mind, or did they have lubricating tubes stuck into her, or what? So he asks that because he's young. He's trying to figure this stuff out. And then it gets to the point where he says, it only took a few strokes. He was too new, too young, too eager to last long. A few strokes was all he needed, but it was all she needed too. They came together, a red flush washing over her skin as she arched against him, and she shook soundlessly. Think about how when Dany is having sex with Eerie on the ship, that when Dany has an orgasm, what do her dragons do? They react just like Dany does. They react just like this. And I'll add that in Martinworld, touch and sex is the strongest form of mental connection and control. Control is it. As it's very explicitly described and shown in his story, A Song for Raya. So that's it. That's the first big scene we get, and that's what everybody gets stuck on. It's like everybody's brain ends at that scene, but it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And when we start to get other information like the red shadows, Melisandre is a red shadow, as is the new Fire and Blood character Sandok the Shadow, and Jonquil Dark, known as the Scarlet Shadow. So closely did she guard her quote good Queen Alysanne as her sworn shield. Daenerys and dragons, and especially Drogon, are frequently called the Shadow or a shadow. So we have all of these fiery sulfur sex images right away, and it's all linked to the dragon element, and we see this in Dany's arc primarily. Even secondary information in Dany's arc, or what's going to be Dany's arc, in A Dance with Dragons and Victarion, when he has the long horn, he's very sensual with it. It says Victarion ran his hand along it. The horn was as warm and smooth as the dusky woman's thighs, so shiny that he could see a twisted likeness of his own features in its depths. Strange sorcerer's writings had been cut into the bands that girded it. Valyrian glyphs, Makoro called them. So, real quickly, the horn is not for Victarion to blow. It's for Dany to blow. That's why she is the unburnt. She is going to blow Dragonbinder, which will bind Dany's. The dragon has 3 heads. Those heads are going to be her new army. the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and the Greyjoys. That is what it binds people to the dragon. It doesn't bind dragons to a person. It binds people to a dragon, because she is a master mind controller that she's learning all along the way, that she's already done. And that's actually something George, since his 1993 outline, has described and planned that she's going to do. She's going to be able to control people with her mind. Hold on, let me find it for you. Okay, and I can link to this if you guys want. But in his 93 outline, he says, Daenerys will bide her time, but she will not forget. Because remember, that's the first time we hear in the story about somebody not remembering something. It's Viserys telling Dany that dragons remember, dragons don't forget. And then it says, when the moment is right, she will kill her husband to avenge her brother, which she sort of does via mind control, coaxing the whole situation with the golden crown. And then it says, and then flee with a trusted friend into the wilderness beyond Vaes Dothrak, which that's most likely Jorah. And they're hunted by something that's unclear in the text. She stumbles on a clutch of dragon eggs, and a young dragon will give Daenerys the power to bend the Dothraki to her will. Then she begins to plan for her invasion of the Seven Kingdoms. So, yeah, this is something George has been planning, not just since this 93 outline or 91 when he started writing the story, but since he started writing back in the 60s. Okay, a few other Ice and Fire and Martinworld comparisons here. The machinery that Trager is using. These are essentially just a different furniture version of the ore-eating wyverns that are mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire that's helping create the dragons, as well as the excessive tunneling under Valyria that caused the mountainous explosion, the Doom of Valyria, and the Ice Dragon version being the Doom of Hardhome. I forget what that's really called, but I call it the Doom of Hardhome because it's essentially the same thing, just the ice version. However, these are also the same power wagons and blast cannons that we see in 7 Times Never Kill Man, which are the same dragon wagons that Aegon the Unworthy commanded the pyromancers to build for him. Yeah, how many times has George said in interviews, and that's a bit of a rhetorical question because I have it all linked here, that dragons do not build, they do not plant any trees, they do not sow. So those cute t-shirt slogans from A Song of Ice and Fire, they have been in the works since the 70s. So then we go on a little bit, and Trager is, he's at work, and he's thinking about himself, he's thinking about life, and he's lonely. And his mind keeps going back to the meat houses. It says that week he thought long after he'd faded his light panels into black. And his thoughts were a frightened jumble. Payday was coming again, and Cox would be after him to return to the meat house. And yes, he wanted to. It had been good, exciting. For once he had felt confident and virile. But it was so easy and cheap and dirty. There had to be more, didn't there? Love, whatever that was. Yes, this is why George has all of this poetry and all of these songs written into his own self, which is reflected in his stories. This is a crux of the story. And then it goes on, he says, beneath the covers he masturbated, hardly thinking of it, while he resolved not to return to the meat house. So these are now a temptation for him. They're a temptation out of sheer loneliness. It's really kind of sad. Then we get a little bit more of the mechanics of this whole system, this whole operation. And furniture-wise, this is how it fits into 1,000 Worlds. In A Song of Ice and Fire, furniture-wise, that's changed, but it still exists. It says, one day in a moment of weakness, he told Cox and the others. Cox looked at him, shook his head, grinned. Somebody else snickered. Then they all began to laugh. What an ass you are, Trager, Cox said at last. There is no fucking handler. Don't tell me you've never heard of a feedback circuit. That is the same device that is used and overridden in Override. So this is in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's really just some sort of telepathic control. So like George said that Danny, from the outline that Danny was going to be able to do, we're going to see this being put to the test with Bran, with Hodor, and anything that he learns while he's in the cave with Bloodraven and the children as he goes back and sees the events through time. Yes, Bran is being a little bit naughty right now, but he's a kid. He doesn't understand his powers. His talents, I should say. All of that information has been suppressed. He, has been fed misinformation that the children don't exist, that Green Scene doesn't exist, that he's not a warg, all this stuff. So if he was trained from the beginning, he would absolutely know what was going on. But unfortunately, maesters and the wrong type of, quote, modernization started the story of Song of Ice and Fire that now Bran later in life has to go back and sort of fix. Poor Bran. That kid. He's just a kid. And even Trager here. He says, that night alone in his room with all the lights burning white and hot, Trager faced himself and turned away, sickened. He was good at his job. He was proud of that. But the rest... See, it's not just that Bran is going to get this talent and go hog wild. He's going to reflect on it, and more importantly, his reflections, so to speak, are probably going to come through what he learns through the Weirwood net. The Weirwood net essentially is the feedback circuit. So then we get to When I Was 1 in 20. Which again is based on songs and poetry, and I have it all linked in the story if you want to read it. But this section, Josie was the first. She was beautiful, had always been beautiful, knew she was beautiful. All that had shaped her made her what she was. She was a free spirit. She was aggressive, confident, conquering. Like Trager, she was only 21 when they met, but she had lived more than he had, and she had seemed to have the answers. He loved her from the first. So this is very much the impression that John gets from Ygritte as he first meets her, and then I guess like the next chapter or two later when he gets to re-meet Ygritte and see what she's like. I think John even uses a line that's something like, yeah, she truly is a wildling, isn't she? As he's thinking to himself. And then we have a good example here of how Trager is growing. So he says he was taller now, broad and heavy, with both muscle and fat. He was often moody and silent and self-contained. Stable, solid, unemotional. That was Trager. He touched no one, and no one touched him. Even the tortures had stopped, though the scars remained inside. Trager hardly knew they were there. He never looked to them. So through his physical development, he's shutting down emotionally. And he's not touching people. Like we just said a few minutes ago, touch is one of the most important connecting factors between humans and all of his work. You have to touch them. That is the strongest bond. So Trager is growing and he's slimming down and he's getting muscle, and he's sort of just like filling out like a man does. But he's still thinking of the dead, the meat houses. An opposite parallel to this in A Song of Ice and Fire is with Samwell Tarly, who is another germ autobiographical person or character. Sam loses weight. He loses his virginity in the whole fat pink masked scene, which is a beautiful scene, by the way. Theon also uses that term, but nobody teases Theon about that. Why is that? Anyway, so, and Samwell gains muscle and he gains confidence and he gains a family. That's the thing, is Samwell, as when he said his vows or took his oaths to the old gods, to the green gods, you know, symbolically in the story, he became a green element, not just because of coming from where he does and his house sigil and all of that stuff, which is a hunter, which is like Sam the Slayer and blah, 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 and all that other cool stuff. He becomes a green element in the story. And green is the life. And then this is what Samwell does. It's the parallel opposite of what Trager is going through. So Samwell is optimistic George. So optimistic George, another opposite parallel to Trager at this moment in the story, is the theme that a person's life should have meaning, not their death. Also detailed more so in Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh. That's a really big theme in that story. And this is why, among many other reasons, that Jon Snow, brace yourself now. Jon Snow might not be dead as the fandom assumes. There's just not enough there. However, more importantly, if you're watching this and you are interested in Martinworld at all, that you'll know that following Martinworld writing style, you can see why George responded a few years ago to an interviewer asking him. So he's like, so why'd you kill Jon Snow? And he says, oh, you think he's dead, do you? And I have a whole page written about that if you want the quotes, if you want the source and all of that. But that's the thing. Jon is probably not like dead the way that we think he is, because life has meaning, not their death. Jon is not done yet with the meaning of his life. He might be dead at the end of the story, probably, but we'll see. And going back to Quentin, a lot of people kind of think of Quentin Martell as sort of a Jon in a different parallel arc, and he sort of is. And that's where we get this information. Did his death have meaning? Garrus, again, who is a Cox parallel, Garrus asks him, did his death have meaning? And he asks him again. He's like, because Quentin is, he's thinking of death and all this stuff that's coming at him, and he's sending for a corpse cart and all this other stuff, and that's when it comes up that men's lives have meaning, not their deaths. So you know how in A Song of Ice and Fire, how the whole line of Targaryens were trying to hatch dragons. They weren't quite getting it right. It took Dany herself to get it right. All of those other Targaryens failed in what they were attempting, which is fine. That's what happens. Well, that's why all of the father figures in Jon's arc have all died, from Rhaegar to Ned to Qhorin Halfhand to Lord Commander Mormont. They unfortunately all died so Jon could live. So, but that's another page. That's another something. So if you haven't left this video yet, because I said all that, let's continue. Trager starts to develop a relationship in his mind. He starts to develop a relationship with Josie that's very much like the tale of Night's King, Corpse, Queen. Again, that whole myth and tale did not originate in A Song of Ice and Fire. It has been floating around in George's head for 40 some years now. And what happened in that story of the Corpse Queen? Fearing nothing, he chased her and caught her and loved her, though her skin was cold as ice. And when he gave his seed to her, he gave his soul as well. We'll compare that to this part in Meathouse Man, where Trager starts to think, and she would love him, cried the day, and she would laugh, the nights replied. Trager chased her for a year of pain and promise, the first year that he had ever lived. On that night, the day voice agreed. He was alive now. He would never return to the emptiness of his time before Josie. He would never go back to the meat house. That far, at least, he'd come. He could challenge, he could change, and someday he would be strong enough to tell her. So I know there's a lot of current fandom discussion about Corpse Queen, and that she's some sort of analog for modern day feminism, and it could be. I mean, if that's what you're reading into it, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. If that's what you're getting out of it and it appeals to you, that's great. George in his writing style, I don't think that's what he's trying to say. And if you're trying to evaluate Martinworld as a whole, so you make better speculation on Ice and Fire, I think it's best to go with the author's voice. So things don't really work out between Josie and Trager, which brings us to Promises of Someday. The title of this chapter is one George reused for his 1987 television show version of his Beauty and the Beast. It was season 1, episode 16. It was titled Promises of Someday. And the episode synopsis there talks about an uneasy reunion between Vincent and Devon that leads to the revelation of one of Father's long-kept secrets. So this is when Trager meets a friend, he meets Donnelly, and this is when they're on Vandalia and they start cutting down trees. So we have this fire element person going somewhere else and cutting down trees. I say this all the time, dragons consume trees. That's what it is. Cutting into a tree like a weirwood tree is an act of fire. And it starts out, the fire had burned out long ago, and Stevens and the forester had retired, but Trager and Donnelly still sat around the ashes on the edges of the clear zone. They talked softly so as not to wake the others, yet their words hung long in the restless night air. The uncut forest standing stark behind them was dead still. The wildlife of Vandalia had all fled the noise that the fleet of buzz trucks made during the day. And then this is when Trager starts to tell Donnelly his secret, what he thinks of as a secret, that he was in love with Josie back on another world. And Donnelly is supporting him. He's like, oh yeah, that's great. Don't feel bad about yourself that she's not here. You're a good person. Just stay positive. Think good thoughts and it'll all be good, right? Oh, no, that's not really how it works out. Also at this point, under Promises of Someday, you'll notice that we're getting into more of the Night's Watch, or current Night's Watch, as the story starts with it. Not historically how the Night's Watch started, but current Night's Watch, with the cutting back of the trees and the living alone without women or families. That's all Ice Dragon element stuff. And even John notices and mentions that when certain Night's Watch hunters go out, or even when Ghost goes out, that the hunting for food source has become scarce. Things are dying around there. And that's because probably a more recent history in the Night's Watch organization, but also because I swear to God, by the end of A Dance of Dragons, the ice dragon others are like right there. That cold that John felt was not the cold. It was the cold of death, but it wasn't the cold of death. It was the cold of the ice dragon. There's even a love-lorn love-lost discussion between John and Tormund when they meet each other again towards the end of A Storm of Swords. And Tormund is asking about Ygritte, and John's like, she's dead. And Tormund responds, he says, Tormund gave a sad shake of his head, a waste. If I had been 10 years younger, I had stolen her myself. That hair she had, well, the hottest fires burn out quickest. So Ygritte was not ever going to last from her conception, unfortunately. To Ygritte, kissed by fire, he drank deep. And it's at this point in the story, like each of these sections, I put in a little snippet of the artwork from Raya Golden. And take some time to look at those because they're really beautiful. And she did a great job of not being gory, but really capturing like the eerie, dark loneliness, the stillness of what's going on in the story, the theme of the story. So we go on a little bit and we get phrases like this from the story. They had a tight-knit group, 3 handlers, a forest, 13 corpses. Okay, so again, we have more references to the development of the Night's King and the number 13 that's used in this archetype. Again, a reference to the fire and the third head and even the Valyrian melted rock for castles and roads. And again, the 3 heads has the dragon. That's Dany and her blowing the Valyrian horn, so she gets her army before her invasion. That's a tight-knit group. I'll call that a tight-knit group from now on out. You better believe it. That'll be my new huzzah. But even through this, even on a new planet, even with a new friend in Donnelly, Trager still can't get over that emotional hump. And we get to sections like this. It says, yet still the nights would come. Those were the worst times, as always. Those were the hours of Trager's lonely, lonely walks. If Josie had given Trager much, she had taken something too. She had taken the curious deadness he had once had, the trick of not thinking, the pain blotter of his mind. On Scracky, he had walked the corridors infrequently. The forest knew him far more often. And then he goes on and says, 1,000 times he touched her cheek and saw her spin away. So that opening song that we got, My Featherbed, and how she smiled and how she laughed, the maiden of the tree, she spun away and said to him, no featherbed for me. And I want to point out that song about the featherbed, My Featherbed, was essentially written on the spot by Thomas Evans, and it was written for Arya and Gendry. So Gendry being sort of a Jon step-in for the Arya arc, we can deduce from that those two are going to get back together. George pretty much said so at Balticon 15, but that doesn't mean they're going to stay together. So we might see another Trager and Josie situation. Josie is very much like an Arya prototype. Her short, choppy hair at times, her wildness, her tendency to do things occupationally for Josie, her tendency to take on roles and do things that are typically reserved for the men or the males in the world. That all comes from this archetype. So as much as I want Gendry and Arya just to get together and be happy and have little wolf puppies, I don't know that that's going to happen long term. Then we get to Gideon. We start to get descriptions of Gideon. He goes to Gideon. Gideon, if think back to what the name means, it's all about fighting. Gideon is the city, the heart of Vandalia, like Valyria. And through it of Slag and Scracky and New Pittsburgh and all the other corpse worlds, the harsh, ugly places where men would not work and corpses had to. Great towers of black and silver metal, floating aerial sculptures that flashed in the sunlight and shone softly at night. The vast, bustling spaceport where freighters rose and fell on invisible fire wands. Malls where the pavement was polished, iron spike wood that gleamed a gentle gray. Gideon. So this is Valyrian architecture. We also see this in Dragonstone. We see this in Valyria, but we also see it in other Proto-Valyrian stories, such as Night Kings with the little castles that the Sand Kings. Did I say Night Kings or Sand Kings? In the story Sand Kings, that the little castles that the Sand Kings build. In the Glass Flower, Cyrene's obsidian castle that she has specially built. That's Proto-Valyrian architecture. And the House of the Worm, it's the same thing. And Night Flyers, the ship is the mothership had made specifically to her requirements. That's essentially Valyrian architecture in space, a dragon spaceship. And 7 Times Over Kill Man, we see this in this Tower of Ashes. So when George puts people in this situation, you got to pay attention. The city with the rot, the corpse city, the meat mart. Again, shy by the shadow, where dragons come from. Bran sees this. Dragons come from a shy, or a shy by the shadow. Wherever their original stock had come from, their genetic manipulation started there and then merged with Valyria. Nobody else has these dragons. You can't deny it. And then we get little nods like this. The meat houses of Vandalia were far famed. The corpses were guaranteed beautiful. Okay, again, the pleasure houses and the people of Leech are far famed for their sexual talents, as well as Leech being one of the few places where the blood of old Valyria runs strong. These are not just coincidental world building things that George put into A Song of Ice and Fire. These are things that have been in his mind for 40 plus years. So even though he's there, even though he's now in Gideon, he's in this like cool, more metropolitan type of city, he says to himself, he could not touch these people. He could not reach them. He didn't know how. It wasn't possible. It wouldn't work. He could rise and walk out into the street and grab one, and they still would not touch. And the stranger would pull free and run. This is the same problem that Raya was having, trying to connect with Rob in the story A Song for Raya. And what did she do? She chose to embrace the fire, lava, Grishka god instead, because that was the only place where she felt she could have actual union, a full embrace of this fire element that in the end actually just consumes you. So it's kind of a mind trick. But that's what depression and loneliness and sadness does, right? Is it messes with our minds. It devalues us in our own observation and our own reflections back to us. We have no value because of something that our mind is playing mind games with. And even still, Trager returned to the wilderness camp, and his corpses flew their buzz trucks like men gone wild. But he was strangely silent around the campfire, and he did not talk to Donnelly at night. So we're starting to get some things where we see the loneliness, like in For a Single Yesterday, where we have the same type of character that's actually a Bran prototype that's very lonely. Bran is very lonely. He loves Mira, but Mira is not returning his love. And this character in For a Single Yesterday, he sits by the tree. He sits at the base of a tree in a sleeping bag. So he's almost like a worm. And he sits there, and it's by a stream. So, and then Trager, he's sitting there, and we get to the point, and it says, and found him by a languid, death-dark stream, sitting on the bank with a pile of throwing stones at his feet. So again, in Martinworld, between all of these stories and all of what we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, what Bran is experiencing already in that sunless sea, that dark cave that he's in with Mira, that he wants to reach out to and touch, but he can't. She spins away. Remember that part? That's the Darkling Stream, or the Darkling Plain. And George goes back and forth between those two terms, but it means the same thing. Again, it comes from the poem by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach. The central idea of that poem is that sadness and misery are guaranteed to be a part of human life, especially now that society lacks the religious faith that it used to sustain humans in times of trouble. So finding that balance between societal advancement and faith, and maintaining yourself is one of the strongest underpinnings of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's all about your identity. Then we get to the Pilgrim Up and Down, this section. This chapter title is another reference to the Chris Christopherson song, and I have all of the lyrics in the video there if you want to take a look at it. But this is where we meet Laurel. Laurel is the Brienne of Tarth prototype in this story. But she's not the only Brienne of Tarth prototype in Martinworld. We also have Blue Jeray from In the Lost Lands, and a bit of Jesse from The Pear-Shaped Man, and a few other elements in the Skin Trade. So Brienne is sort of and all of these, between those stories, all of these archetypes are the same, but it's like each time George adds on a little bit more and more and more until he got to Brienne, which was much more fully developed by then. So what about this Laurel? Pretty. Trager didn't think so, not at first. She was too tall, half a foot taller than he was, and she was a bit on the heavy side, and more than a bit on the awkward side. Her hair was her best feature, her hair that was red-brown in winter and glowing blonde in the summer. Okay, there's a bunch more description about her. But she was not beautiful, not the way Josie had been beautiful. So this is a little bit how Jaime thinks between his attraction to Brienne, but also back to Cersei, who was so gloriously beautiful. And then he says, although oddly, she grew more beautiful with time. Same as Jaime thinks about Brienne. And then that also brings us to another song that's in A Song of Ice and Fire, Seasons of My Love. In A Song of Ice and Fire, it's about a fair maid with seasonal colors reflected in her hair, because that is what trees do. That is, they change color with the seasons. Bran is a tree element. When asked if Brienne was the descendant of Dunk, Germ confirmed that she is, and we need to remember that Dunk, or Duncan the Tall, is a tree elemental in A Song of Ice and Fire, not just through their shields, but through their actions, through their plots. They are there to serve the many. They are not there to serve or consume to feed the one, as it says for fire. I have a few quotes about Brienne too, but we all know them, and we all know how Brienne sort of gets the short end of the stick sometimes. Dang it. So Trager and Laurel, they fall in love, and everything is going well. And he gets a new job, and because he doesn't want to be all sweaty and stinky and go back to Laurel, who's he goes to every night, her warm body against his, and they laugh and they talk and talk and talk and talk, and they talk all night long. And he glowed, and he wanted to share with his friends, his friends with Laurel, and he'd already mentioned Donnelly a lot, and he wanted Donnelly to see how happy he'd become, to see what belief he could accomplish. So remember how I said that once Trager got to Vandalia and started cutting down the trees, and that's when he met Donnelly, and that's when we started to see like some of the Night's Watch analogs or parallels from this story to that. Yeah, Donnelly essentially becomes like a brother to him, an occupational brother, just as the brothers of the Night's Watch are occupational brothers. And there's a blood betrayal that's about to happen. Huge theme across almost every single George story ever is this blood betrayal or brother versus brother betrayal that we see. That's really sad. Wonder where, I don't know where in his personal real life he got it from. That's not something I'm trying to remember it's not something I can, for him personally, like blood, he doesn't have brothers. So this would have to be, if he's pulling this idea from real life, it would have to be from another author. But again, even through this, things are great with Josie for a while. Then we get to this part. The sex was never as good as the Meathouse. And after a while, Laurel began to close. More and more nights now she went to sleep after they made love. The days when they talked till dawn were gone. Perhaps they had nothing left to say. Trager had noticed that she had a tendency to finish his stories for him. It was nearly impossible to come up with one she hadn't already told her. So that's another similarity that Jamie and Brienne share, and it also gives us a glimpse into the future ending between Jamie and Brienne. Because what happens? Here we go. Donnelly looked up at him, then abashed, back down again. I don't know. Oh, Greg, she loves you more anyway. She said so. I never should have expected anything else. I feel like I've stabbed you in the back. Okay. Brother versus brother. Yeah, that's because of love. Remember how George is reusing the idea of love his way. Guess who pushed Bran out the window? It was Jamie. Why'd he do it? He said he did it for love. What was that love? The love was for his fiercely fire element, incest relationship that he has with Cersei. That is a dragon element. Just as when Jon gets stabbed at the mutiny attempt, that is, and Bowen Marsh is crying, he's pretty much saying the same thing. He's like, I didn't mean to. It's like the things you do for love. But George's idea of love is not as we readers are expecting it to be. So when you get a lot of analysis from other people in the fandom and they're like really pushing it traditionally, I can't get behind that because it's not the way George is doing it. And unfortunately or fortunately, it's his world. He's the god. It's his rules. I don't make them. And we get more little nods to the fire element that Trager is. He says his face once tanned, now ashen. Laurel, he said, not believing. That's because Laurel and Donnelly are falling in love with each other and they're sort of pushing Trager out of the way. This is another area in the story where I've seen some really bad takes on reviews with this story, where some people have implied that it was a missed opportunity that George did not put them together in a threesome. Why would George do that? This is like, again, this is like a page from his diary. This is something that's very important and personal to him. Why should he make something up to put in there that did not happen if this is something that's reflecting his life? In this age of authenticity that we are in, I find it a little bizarre that people are pushing for this. But again, what that shows you is people favor their own outcome rather than the author's word on the situation. So they break up, and Trager says it was worse than Josie, 1,000 times worse. Thinking of Jamie again. She's been fucking Lancel and Osmond Kettleblack and Moonboy for all I know. He thinks about Trager and Jamie both. They think about this over and over again. Their breakups. And so this story is a good compass as to which direction things are moving. And then Trager starts to have not so good luck with his work side either. So things are crumbling all around him. It says he tried to keep on at the theater. He enjoyed the work. He had the friends there, but it was impossible. Donnelly was there every day, smiling and being friendly. And sometimes Laurel would come to meet him after the day's show, and they went off together, arm in arm. Trager would stand by and watch, try not to notice, while the twisted thing inside him shrieked and clawed. That's pretty intense. And I know I've been in situations like that before. I've been in a lot of situations feeling like Trager a lot, which is why I love this story. And it's one of the ones that if a story was to make me cry, it would be this one. This is also where the title Wanderings, it's also based, this is the section where it's based on the Yeats poem. And I have all of the information there. And it tells of a man going out into the woods to seek peace from the fire burning in his head, the fire of love and passion. And as I said in the beginning, following George through the autobiography section and dream songs and interviews, we learn that around the same age as Trager is, or somewhere thereabouts, or the time that the story was written, George, drawing upon his life for this, he had to move back to Bayonne at one point, and he was feeling really low and really down. And I have links to it in this thread, but when I went to get Fire and Blood, wherever it is up there, when I went to get my signed copy of Fire and Blood in New Jersey and to meet George again, I went to George's neighborhood that he grew up, right exactly where he grew up. All of this information is written in Dream Songs and on his blog. This is not some creepy thing that I tracked down. He's given this information out readily, and his neighborhood was literally about 15 minutes away from the theater. And I was several hours early to the theater, and I was like, what the hell? And I went there. And I took a few pictures, and the Kilvan Call River is quite literally his front yard next to this park with these big gnarly trees. You can see where he got the idea for big gnarly weirwoods from, and then New York City across the water with all of the lights, which you read his work and you can see why he is a little bit into the lights across the water, that and The Great Gatsby. Focus, Leech, focus. But yeah, this part, this section, what is it? We're at 5.2 now. This is getting back to like George personal information, like written straight into the story. Thank you, Harlan Ellison. You know, the quote is, Trager stood stiff against a tree, his eyes on the river, his hands folded tightly against his chest. He was a statue. He hardly seemed to breathe. Not even his eyes moved. So after this, Trager tries to reach out to Josie again via fire visions, if you go by the furniture rule. And he tries to call her basically by viewable telephone, which would be like FaceTime nowadays. So he tries to FaceTime her, and there's clearly somebody else there, because she's like, oh, hey, Trager. And she's like looking off screen, and she's like, I gotta go. And it doesn't go well. So that just sinks him down deeper into despair. So then we get to a few parts in the story where we get to the other corpse handlers equivalents in A Song of Ice and Fire, like and the brooding, like Rhaegar's Summer Hall. and the House of Black and White, and with the Faceless Men, which are a death cult. So there's a couple of world building callbacks to those parts of A Song of Ice and Fire. And remember the phrase, the High Valyrian, again, High Valyrian language that says, with the many-faced god, is Valar Morghulis, the High Valyrian, for all men must die. And the traditional response is Valar Dohaeris, which means all men must serve. Again, this is that mental and bodily slavery that the dragons and other fire elements represent in Martinworld. That either corporate or governmental overreach, how they then this, the quote, small folk have to, like, it's either bow or burn, you know. And there's more than one type of slavery in Martinworld, not just bodily slavery, but mental slavery. And that is huge. That is bigger. That is a much bigger fear factor in Martinworld than bodily slavery is. So everything Dany is doing in Essos, I'll get to that in another video, because it's not as what's the word I'm looking for? It's not as like it's not as like pious or for the good as you might think. She's actually creating a mental army. Again, that Valyrian dragon horn, the dragon binder. Okay, so Trager is still down. This is one of the deepest pits, darkling stream moments that he's in right now. And he's having these visions and he's having these sensations about a light that was so hot and white that it hurt the eyes. The music bright and joyful, the sounds of people laughing. None of it was good to him. Then Trager would run, though his feet were raw bundles of pain and his lungs burned with the haze he was breathing. He would run and run and run until he reached the room with the open door. So, and sorry, then it says, only when he got there, it was his room and it was empty. Okay, so again, this is like a bit like the house with the red door for Daenerys, which is in most Dany prototype stories, including Simon Cress and Sand Kings. So again, if you want to understand George, study George. So also like Daenerys in the House of the Undying Ones, who are basically meat men being puppeted by something larger. You know, when she goes into the house and there's all the people, the corpses that are sitting around with the blue floating heart, they're being puppeted by something larger. And again, don't click away yet. That something larger is this fire element that is probably Daenerys herself. This is something she's manifesting or controlling, as we see Trager do in the beginning of this story. What are they doing? The shape of shadows. Remember, we were talking about shadows at the beginning of this stream. The shape of shadows. Morrow's not yet made. So somehow this is a mental extension of what Dany is going through in her arc, one way or another. And then they say, drink from the cup of ice, drink from the cup of fire, mother of dragons, child of three. Again, here we go. So choosing to drink from the cup of ice or the cup of fire, that's something Dany and Euron both do. Euron is not a failed student of Bloodraven. I'm not even going to get into it right now, but that does not even make any sense. Euron went there and he chose to drink from the cup of ice. That's why his lips are blue. They gave him the choice. He chose that cup and blah, 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 blah. All of this together. Dany drank from the cup of fire. We read how she experiences things. Plus, she's the red fire element in the title of the series, as George said. And Euron is he's probably not the biggest big bad of the ice, but he's like the first step you have to get through. Anyway, back to this. So, choosing to drink from the cup or cup of ice or fire is an existential choice that these two villains or antagonists, whatever you want to call them, are on the peripheries that we are encountering in the story. Just as George said in that interview, they chose their destiny on their own. As opposed to the green elementals who drink from the green fountain, as it says in the story. They are taught not to call people back from death. They are taught not to interrupt death, not to invade people's space. Again, this is something that Bran is learning now. They are taught not to create wights and walking corpses, a misuse of this talent that the extreme ice and fire elements exploit. Now, there could have been some splinter branch of the green element that had a hand in creating some of these big bads that we're about to experience in the story, but those are all theories right now, and we don't really know because the dragons, because of Cyrene of Lilith and Ash. I'm not going to go into it right now. Whatever the white was first, I am the next. That is what she says in that story. Yeah, so even in A Dance with Dragons, Bran 3, Leaf says, "No, he is gone, boy. Do not seek to call him back from death, because that is not good. That's not what he's supposed to do. You have this talent, you have this ability, but to use it is an abomination." So that's something Bran has to learn. And he is. So Traeger's still deep down in this darkling plane, and we get to the section Duvalier's dream. And then it starts with, "Her name does not matter. Her looks are not important. All that counts is that she was. That Traeger tried again. That he forced himself on and made himself believe and didn't give up. He tried, but something was missing. Magic?" The words were the same. So Duvalier's dream is about a man who is a disillusioned dreamer who would never love again. Again, full lyrics and everything are on this page if you want to read everything. Then Traeger goes on and he says, "How many times can you speak them?" Traeger wondered. "Speak them and believe them, like you believed them the first time you said them. Once, twice, 3 times, maybe, or 100? And the people who say it 100 times, are they really so much better at loving or only at fooling themselves? They aren't really people who long ago abandoned the dream, who use it as a name for something else." Straight up reused again in A Song for Raya. And this is what Bloodraven experiences. This is the existential loneliness that Bran is most likely going to experience by from the end of the book going forward. He can't have children. He can't have a family because of his role that he's going to play. And it's going to be very sad, but it's not going to be dragon level sad. He's not going to react to it as if he had dragons. He's going to handle it differently. But this story and a second kind of loneliness, and For a Single Yesterday, those are all stories that foreshadow Bran's future. Not the only ones that do, but some of the main ones that do. And I have most of those transcribed on my book club page if you want to read them. So after all this, this dark pit of despair that he's in, this darkling plane where he is at, what does he do? That's when Traeger switches his job again and he goes to the gladiatorials. Remember, using all of these dead people in the ways that he does is just an outward expression of what he's feeling and going through inside. So now he's down in his deepest darkling plane moment, like Dany is out on the darkling stream at the end of A Dance with Dragons. And what do? This is how they're going to react. We have to look at those situations in the story, think of how George handles them, and hopefully predict or speculate more accurately for the future of A Song of Ice and Fire. So under echoes, the enemy corpse is huge and black, its torso rippling with muscle, a product of months of exercise, the biggest thing that Trager had ever faced. It advances across the sawdust in a slow, clumsy crouch, holding the gleaming broadsword in one hand. Trager watches it come from his chair atop one of the end of the fighting arena areas. The other corpse master is careful, cautious. This is, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, this is Drogon, big and black and muscly and ripped. This is Drogon that we're going to see when from the Winds of Winter going forward. This is Robert Strong, also a type that was used in Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh. This is Cleon of Astapor and other undead fighting men, such as the Unsullied. They are all symbolically undead. That Dany, quote, brought them back to her worship, her side. It's also in Sand Kings. Remember, all three of Dany's dragons, that's Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal, they're all undead and woken by their corpse handler herself, Daenerys. This was done using fire and blood secrets of Valyria that Daenerys herself was able to recreate using the wisdom buried in her blood, as she says. And I have an essay called Waking the Last Dragon that explains all of it, quote by quote. Fire doesn't kill a dragon, it wakes a dragon. And that is exactly what happened. You know how Targaryens, you can't just hop onto another dragon in Targaryen land? Yeah, it's because they only take one handler, one rider at a time. And Dany has 3. Also, these fighting pits, that's very much like the Dragon Pit on the Hill of Rhaenys and Daznak's Pit in Meereen, of course, and then Sand Kings again. I love that story. And after this, Trager chooses violence. That's where he is. He has no connection, no touch with anybody. He's tried. He can't. There's something in him that's holding it back. He can't touch anyone. And his only means of getting out his frustrations, or the way he chooses to do it, is the fighting pits. And Dany accepts the fighting pits to reopen. She accepts the money that can be gained from opening the fighting pits again. And the Dragon Pit in the Hill of Rhaenys, that's where they did all sorts of events happen, including the the seeding, looking for dragon riders. I think it was called the seeding, or the red sowing. No, the red sowing. Looking for dragon riders, and it was basically a big failure. It's because a corpse only has one handler. And then we get to the conclusion. The conclusion is one line. And it's as sad as it is, it's beautifully ended. You don't need much to say. You read the story, you go through everything, you go through these emotions and phases of Traeger's life with him. There's not much else to be said by the end. And I think George ended it beautifully, as best as he could. Of all the bright, cruel lies they tell you, the cruelest is the one called love. Again, a Game of Thrones, Bran 2. 7, Bran said, shaking with relief. His fingers had dug deep gouges in the man's forearm. He let go sheepishly. The man looked over at the woman. The things I do for love, he said with loathing. He gave Bran a shove. A Game of Thrones, Daenerys 9. She lifted her head. I am Daenerys Stormborn, Daenerys of House Targaryen, of the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel, and old Valyria before them. I am the dragon's daughter, and I swear to you, these men will die screaming. Now bring me Khal Drogo. He was lying on the bare red earth, staring up at the sun. So that is the story. I highly recommend that you guys read it yourself. I know I did not include every note, every reference, everything. So I wait to hear what you guys find yourself. I think that's going to be awesome. I have a lot of respect for this story and a lot of respect for George to put it out there, but not just put it out there, but to bring it back to everybody's attention from Dream Songs. It's, these are stories that he selected himself for a reason. And between the two Dream Songs anthologies, that's less than half of his total work. So he had a lot to choose from. And we should pay attention to why he selected these particular stories. Let's see. So I just want to end with the Robert Frost poem that everybody likes to refer to and that George has referred to, even if he's not going exactly 1-to-1 as we believe. The question from an interviewer: why your saga is called A Song of Ice and Fire? Because of the wall and the dragons, or is something more beyond that? George: oh, that's the obvious thing, but yes, there's more. People say I was influenced by Robert Frost's poem, and of course I was. I mean, fire is love, fire is passion, fire is sexual ardor, and all of the things. Ice is betrayal, ice is revenge, ice is, that kind of cold inhumanity and all the stuff being played out in the books. And the poem goes: some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So thank you for hanging out with me for this long. I can't believe it. I'll have links to everything if you're looking at this on YouTube, I'll have links to everything in the show notes below. If you're on my blog page, thank you for reading along, and let me know what you guys think. And take some time to read all of the stories and poems and song lyrics that I have linked to as well. That will really enhances the reading of this story and George in general, just George in general. And if you want more germ spreading, I have, I think like 27 George stories transcribed. They don't all have videos yet. The video thing is new for me, but I'm always up for discussing it. And I have 27 other stories and probably 60 essays and whatnot based on Martinworld as a whole. Huzzah, 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 huzzah.